In 1850, a paper was read before the Royal Historical Society of Ireland regarding a group of Chinese porcelain seals which had been found in the previous 80 years in Ireland. In total, there were about 60 seals, and they were claimed to have been found in different places throughout Ireland, ranging from Belfast all the way to Cork. And in addition to being widely dispersed throughout the country, the seals were found in the strangest places, in an orchard, a cave, bogs, and so on. The discovery could not be easily explained at the time, and when the inscriptions turned out to be written in Chinese, there were a number of fanciful hypotheses as to how these seals, which were considered to be of great antiquity, appeared in Ireland. According to these explanations, the seals were either brought over by the Phoenicians or by ancient Irish tribes after their wanderings in China, or by medieval Irish monks coming home from the Middle East. All along, the emphasis was on the extent to which these artifacts corroborated Ireland's ancient connection with the Orient, an idea that was believed and promoted at the time by both Irish nationalists and English imperialists. There were, of course, voices arguing against the antiquity of these seals, but these were stifled by the rising fame of this greatest archaeological mystery of recent times, and their significance in proving long-lost connections between Ireland and the Orient. Doubts raised by reputable scholars, whose qualified opinion should have mattered most in the discussion, were ignored, and the Chinese seals of Ireland gradually came to be known as one of the greatest unexplained mysteries of the world. Some of the seals in question are still extant. From our modern perspective, we can identify these objects as early Qing porcelain seals from the Dehua kilns in Fujian province. And so, even though they might be considered antique today, they were much newer than it was suggested by those in the 19th century who wished to see in them a proof of an ancient link with China. The supposedly ancient writing on them is in the Chinese seal script, which, although at the time identified correctly as having been in use at the time of Confucius, was still used on seals in the 18th century, as it continues to be used today. So here, I would like to look at this phenomenon, how these seals, which at some point in modern times came over to Europe, presumably as souvenirs from an exotic land, were almost purposefully misunderstood so that they would fit contemporary intellectual currents, and how little attention was paid to the cautioning voices of those who were qualified to form an opinion on the subject. So these kind of seals, which were porcelain cubes with inscription on their base and then with an animal on the top, started to appear on the antique market from the end of the 18th century. As far as we can see today, the first of these was found in 1780 by a turf cutter in a bog in Queens County. In the following decades, more seals were recovered in different parts of the country, in different places. In a cave, while digging up the roots of an old pear tree in an orchard, while plowing, in the bed of the Boyne River, while raising gravel. By 1853, over 50 of them had been collected from different parts of Ireland. All were made of white porcelain in the shape of a small cube, with a seated animal on the top. Their similarity implies that they belong together, even though they were found hundreds of miles apart. Besides the mystery why these objects were scattered around the island, another interesting phenomenon was that they were exclusive to Ireland, without a single one reported in England or any other place in Europe. This circumstance was part of the reason why these seals came to signify a long-lost link with China, a connection particular to Ireland. The first written reference to a Chinese seal in Ireland comes from the 1793 edition of Anthologia Hibernica, where a reader asked the advice of others to translate and explain a seal impression. At a first glance, the seal impression does not even seem to be in Chinese, and the identification of the inscription is only possible from later reproductions. It is rather surprising that the person supplying the image identified it correctly as Chinese. In the following decades, more seals were discovered, and in the 1830s, two enthusiasts of antiquities, Joseph Huband Smith and Joseph William Murphy, became involved in the research, gathering impressions and casts. These two gentlemen originally worked separately, but later met to compare their findings, and by the end of the decade, the two of them had acquired over a dozen seal impressions. In December 1839, Smith gave a talk at the meeting of the Royal Irish Academy, exhibiting one seal and impressions of several others in seal wax, stating that all the objects were in the form of an exact cube with a handle which was modeled after some animal, probably an ape. In terms of their physical appearance, the seals were all alike, different only in the inscription at the bottom. Smith referred to the Chinese grammar by Abel Remusat, which showed that the inscriptions on these seals are those of a very ancient class of Chinese characters, in use since the time of Confucius, who is supposed to have flourished in the middle of the 6th century BC. Based on this information, he concluded that the seals were very old, disregarding the fact that although the seal script had indeed been in use since the time of Confucius, it continued to be used on seals up to modern times. Obviously, the appearance of such ancient Chinese artifacts in Ireland called for an explanation. And so Smith suggested that they may have arrived there from the east, along with the weapons, ornaments, or other articles of commerce which were brought to these islands by the ships of the great merchant princes of antiquity, the Phoenicians. So these seals began to acquire a certain reputation as more of them came to light. In 1850, Edmund Getty, a well-known Irish antiquary and linguist, reported on the state of research in a paper read before the Belfast Literary Society, and his report also came out as a book the following year under the title Notices of Chinese Seals Found in Ireland. In this work, Getty describes how he solicited the advice of several friends and acquaintances residing in China to obtain various information about the seals. John Francis Davis, for example, wrote of the characters on the seals that they are perfectly recognizable as the ancient seal characters in China, often used at the present day on the seals of public and private persons. Reverend Karl Gutzlaff wrote that he had showed them to learned Chinese individuals and was told that they were in a seal character, namely only used for seals, particularly in old times. In addition, Getty suggested yet another possible link between Ireland and the Orient, namely medieval Irish pilgrims who had traveled to Egypt and the Holy Land. He referred to a book by the Irish monk Decoil, in which the author had written about a party of pilgrims who sailed up the Nile, described and measured the pyramids, crossed to the Red Sea through a canal, and so on. As a reference, Getty also appended to this book an extract from the work of Decoil, since the original was a rare work. Altogether, Getty succeeded in obtaining translations for the seal impressions and a small group of other inscriptions from 4 different sources in China. Later on, Gutzlaff sent him another set of translations. Thus, there were a total of 5 sets, all of which became part of Getty's book. But besides publishing the translations, Getty also tried to offer some sort of explanation for the object's appearance in Ireland. Getty's book only further promoted the fame of the seals and their mystery. The story appeared not only in Irish and English magazines, but also across the Atlantic. A number of American papers and periodicals told the story of the Irish seals, including the Scientific American, which provided its own hypothesis on the origin of the seals. It is supposed that they may have been brought there by the ancient Phoenicians, but it is our opinion that they were brought there by some of the ancient Irish tribes, who no doubt journeyed through and came down from China. So then additional seals, as they were found, they were sold at auctions at increasing prices, so they were kind of in the news continuously. But despite this excitement, there are also those people who were suspicious about the antiquity of these seals. So in a paper read before the Royal Irish Academy in 1868, Fraser presented a well-informed argument in favor of a more recent date. And in his paper, he raises the issue, for example, of these seals never having been found in places where they were associated with other archaeological objects, like with bronze or stone weapons, Celtic remains, or Danish or Anglo-Norman coins, or even with modern articles of manufacture. So for him, this meant that they were probably accidentally dropped, and this happened not so much earlier. and they were picked up by farmers or workers as they were building something or tilling the earth. And then the other point he says is that, yes, the seals are written in the seal script, which has an ancient origin, but this kind of script is still being used in China for carving seals. And to show that very similar seals can in fact be obtained in China, he showed 3 porcelain seals that had been sent to him by the famous translator James Legge. And Legge wrote that these seals can still be found in China, even though they are not used anymore. They were most used in the Ming Dynasty, and it was at that time that European commerce with China began. And so based on Legge's comments, Fraser concluded that these seals could not be older than the end of the 14th or the beginning of the 15th century. And then a couple of years later, William Lockhart, a medical missionary stationed in China, told a story about buying in Shanghai a small collection of seals identical to those in Getty's book, bearing the same or similar inscriptions. He also found out that these were fairly recent objects, the oldest being only 200 years old. Later on, when he had a chance to visit Dublin, he met with Edward Chitham of the Royal Irish Academy, who related a story told to him by a woman from whom he had bought a couple of such seals. And so he wrote, her reply was that an ancestor of hers, an Irishman, was in the China trade about a century ago, and he was in the habit of bringing home a quantity of Chinaware for friends, to whom he said that the shopkeepers from whom he had made these purchases gave him many of the seals to which he had taken a fancy, and that he used constantly to give them away to friends in Ireland, and that they were carried about in all directions, being curious and interesting little things. And she said that the ones that she just sold, these 2 pieces, were the remains of much larger quantities that this ancestor of hers had brought home. And so Edward Chitham thought that this was kind of the story behind their dispersal throughout Ireland. But he did not believe in these stories, which talked about finding them in an orchard or in some undisturbed place. But despite these occasional notices, there were other people who continued to write about them as an unsolved puzzle. But by the end of the 19th century, the interest in them gradually dissipated until the story suddenly reached a wider audience via Charles Ford's Book of the Damned, which aligned them with the other great mysteries of the world, such as the UFOs and frogs falling from the sky. This book, originally published in 1919, went through nearly 20 editions and had major circulation, so it reached millions of readers, many more than these original notices. So even though Ford only described the circumstances of the discovery, but provided no solution or didn't add any new information, because of the large readership of the book, the subject was brought back into the focus of public interest. And Ford's description of the seals also inspired the makers of the TV series Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World around 1980. In the book version of this series, which appeared shortly after and became a bestseller, the seals, based on the expert opinion of Jan Chapman from Dublin's Chester Beatty Library, were identified as Blanc de Chine porcelain, coming from a factory near Amoy in Fujian province. Chapman believed that the seals dated from the early 18th century, when the factory exported this type of porcelain to Europe. So it was clear from the start that the discovery was more about Ireland than about the seals themselves, or even China, their place of origin. Very little discussion addressed the context of such seals in their native environment, their manufacture, or Chinese cultural and artistic trends. They were treated in the light of what they signified for Ireland, being a proof of its link with the Orient. Ireland is a country of many problems, a land of beauty and sorrow, of political strife or religious and racial hatreds. But apart from these things, the island is the hope of a number of unsolved archaeological puzzles, and not the least of these is the mystery of the Chino-Irish seals, a minor antiquarian enigma of such a curious and unusual type as to make the whole question and details worthy of recapitulation for the benefit of the present year of grace. So within these few sentences, we can also hear that these seals had a greater significance in Ireland. They signified a connection between Ireland and the East before the Christian era. Consequently, the problem shifted from the age of the objects, which was accepted as being very old, to explaining how these could have arrived in Ireland at such a remote time. Looking at the seals today based on their design, we can fairly accurately identify them as De Hua ware from Fujian province, also known in the West as Blanc de Chine. They appear to date to the 18th century, but definitely not earlier than the 17th, and as Chapman has asserted, were most likely brought to Ireland after the early 18th century when the De Hua kilns began exporting to Europe. The inscriptions on the seals are consistent with those on late Ming and early Qing leisure seals, in contrast with other seals from earlier times. As for the seemingly random distribution of them throughout Ireland and the baffling conditions under which they were found, we can make a couple of interesting observations. First, all of the seals undeniably came from a single collection. This is confirmed by their nearly identical physical form, otherwise completely unattested in Europe. No matter how scattered the finds were, all of the seals were found in Ireland, which clearly shows a common point from which the original collection was dispersed. Second, there is a revealing fact that the 50-odd seals were all discovered between 1780 and 1853, with virtually no findings outside this period. This, together with the diverse conditions under which they came to light, precludes the possibility that they could have found their way into the country much earlier. In addition, the fact that no more seals were found after 1853 implies that the discoveries of the seals were not completely accidental or mutually unrelated, as claimed at the time. Here we are reminded of the story that Lockhart recorded about the woman who admitted that the seals were brought to Ireland by her ancestor, who liked giving them away to friends in Ireland. So this is the story of the Chinese seals found in Ireland. Of course, on the one hand, they're closely related to China, but this whole deal about interpreting them in a particular way was much closer related to the political and intellectual currents that were happening in England and in Ireland at the time. All right, I hope this was interesting. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.